When El Chapo was arrested in 2016, the world rejoiced. Perhaps the shocking brutality of the Sinaloa cartel would come to an end. It didn't. Then, his son Ovidio was arrested.
Pase, por favor, pase, por favor. Pasen los tres. Tranquilo. Aquí, señor. Tranquilo. Listo.
Although both his arrests resulted in massacres, his second one saw him extradited to the States to face the same fate as his father. Once again, people hoped the Sinaloa cartel would come to an end. It didn't. As of 2024, the Sinaloa cartel is more powerful than ever, and the latest confessions from Damaso Lopez Serrano prove that the remaining Los Chapitos are even more brutal than their father. Damaso Lopez Serrano is known as Mini Lick, and up to recently, he was a crucial part of the notorious Sinaloa cartel. He was born in Sinaloa in 1987 to Damaso Lopez Nunez. Nunez was a prison guard in Altiplano prison around the time El Chapo made his first escape in 2001. In fact, Nunez was one of the guys who orchestrated his escape after El Chapo bribed a total of $2.5 million to 78 people. El Chapo remembered Nunez's loyalty and he invited him into the Sinaloa ranks. This was happening as Chapo's cartel was growing at an unprecedented rate. And at the same time, in the early 2000s, El Chapo started grooming his sons to be ruthless kill machines like him. Sadly, cartels tend to be family businesses, and the eldest sons rarely escape their fate as sicarios or drug lords. And as El Chapo was grooming Los Chapitos, so was Nunez. Mini Leak started working for the Sinaloa cartel as a teenager, and it wasn't long before El Chapo noticed his extra ruthlessness as well as business savvy. For a while, it seemed like a perfect match. Mini Lick was around the same age as Los Chapitos, and he could work closely with them to establish new smuggling routes and ensure control of their territories, fighting off rival cartels. But after El Chapo's arrest in 2016, things took a turn for the worse. In 2017, Chapo was finally extradited to the United States. He'd escaped prison in Mexico twice, and the US had been pressing the Mexican government to do the right thing once and for all. From the state's highest security federal prison, Chapo could not escape, no matter how much he promised to bribe the guards or warden. His face, right after landing in New York, says it all. He knew he would not get out of this one. And if El Chapo knew, so did his sons and all his collaborators. And you know what happens when a cartel leader is removed? That's right, a feeding frenzy. Everyone is trying to fill in their position, even if that means unaliving former friends. Now, Mini Leak and his dad were no longer besties with Los Chapitos. They were fighting to climb the ranks and establish themselves as main figures within the Sinaloa cartel. In May 2017, Nunez was arrested on a long list of charges, including money laundering, smuggling, and violent crimes. His son knew he had to act fast. In July of that year, Mini Lick handed himself to the authorities in Calexico, the Mexican town in California. This was huge, both to the authorities and the Sinaloa. Mini Lick remains the highest-ranking Mexican cartel leader to hand himself in to US authorities. Instead of controlling the Sinaloa cartel from the inside, Mini Lick chose to control it from the outside. By striking a deal with the DEA, Mini Lick revealed all his secrets and helped arrest and extradite oodles of high-ranking Sinaloa cartel members. And before you ask, yep, one of those is Ovidio Guzman Lopez.
Pase, por favor, pase, por favor. Pasen los tres. Tranquilo. Aquí, señor. Tranquilo. Listo.
By 2017, when Mini Lick was in custody, Los Chapitos had gained notoriety as the new leaders of the Sinaloa.
Judy, they are known as Los Chapitos, the four most trusted sons of the world's most notorious drug kingpin. As the I-Team has reported for several years, federal drug investigators here in Chicago consider El Chapo's sons in charge of the Sinaloa cartel that remains this area's largest trafficker of heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamines.
It was also clear they were at least just as brutal as their father.
They now say this drug lord, nicknamed the Mouse, has ordered the murders of informants, a rival drug trafficker, and a popular Mexican singer who refused to perform at his wedding.
Yeah, that's one of the things Ovidio did. Cartel leaders tend to have very fragile egos. They can only stand to have the last word and final decision. They're not used to hearing no. Experience has taught them that they can just bribe or unalive anyone who does. And El Chapo taught his sons to be just like him. As young adults, they were already behaving in a very similar way, and the DEA had gathered a long list of reasons to arrest them. ASAP. In July 2019, El Chapo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole at the ADX Florence in Colorado. 3 months later, the DEA started a huge operation together with the Mexican military to arrest 2 Chapitos, Ovidio and Ivan. On October 17th, the Mexican authorities localized both brothers. At around 3 a.m., they went after Ivan, but Ivan had men infiltrated everywhere, including the Mexican army, so he learned what was about to go down. He escaped and rallied up his own army, hundreds of sicarios armed much like the SWAT team trying to arrest them. In the early hours of the morning, the military surrounded Ovidio's house. Initially, Ovidio started shooting at the officers. He didn't realize he was heavily outnumbered. When he decided he would probably die in the fire if he continued, he exited his house with his hands up. But news of his arrest traveled fast. Within moments, Ivan's Sicario army and thousands other Sinaloa soldiers descended upon the Mexican military, raining hell on pretty much anyone in their eyesight. Shockingly enough, Ovidio tried to put an end to the massacre.
¿Cuánto tienes gente adentro?
No, no tengo,
Listo.
son mis hijas.
Que paren, diles que paren todo.
Ya.
No veo más. Ya no alcanzo a ver más. Pásame cinta, güey.
Ya paren todo, ya paren todo. Ya paren todo, ya tranquilo, ya. Que me retire. Pero ya, dígale, pues, ya no quiero ya no quiero que haya desmadre.
Hey, Ovidio, páralo.
Ya no quiero que haya desmadre, por favor.
However, it's unclear whether he meant this or he just said it for the camera in case he got arrested. In any case, his statement was irrelevant. It was already an all-out war. The Sicarios released cartel prisoners, set fire to cars to block important roads, and invaded the local airport. Trade and travel were completely stopped in the Sinaloa region for the rest of the day. 7 officers and 1 civilian were unalived, and the surviving civilians were instructed to hide in their homes. The cartels were imposing a curfew on the town until Ovidio was released. To the dismay of many, the Sinaloa's plan worked.
Violence paralyzed the streets of a Mexican city yesterday as security forces traded gunfire with heavily armed members of a drug cartel. The son of the notorious drug kingpin El Chapo was taken into custody, then let go.
President Andrés Manuel López Obrador ordered Ovidio's immediate release to prevent further loss of life. This sends the wrong message, that the authorities are easily intimidated and the cartel is in control. Falco Ernst, senior analyst for the International Crisis Group in Mexico, said the release of Ovidio Guzman set a dangerous precedent and sent a message that the state itself, including the army, could be blackmailed and was not in control. President Obrador explained his decision.
Esta decisión se tomó para proteger a los ciudadanos. Es que no se puede apagar el fuego con el fuego. Esa es la diferencia de esta estrategia con relación a lo que han hecho los anteriores gobiernos. Nosotros no queremos muertos, no queremos la guerra.
However, by January 2023, the president had changed his mind. Around sunrise on January 5th, a SWAT team raided Ovidio's house after he threw a massive party. They knew his soldiers would be too drunk or tired to fight back, and the few soldiers who were awake and guarding his house did not look at the sky, so they did not see the SWAT helicopter descending straight into their yard. By the time they heard its loud engine, it was too late. Ovidio was picked up and flown to the nearest prison, awaiting extradition. Once again, this resulted in a massacre. 29 people lost their lives in under an hour.
These criminal organizations shot with weapons at aircraft from the Mexican Air Force and from commercial airlines and at the international Culiacan airport facilities. Nevertheless, they did not achieve their goal of rescuing the alleged offender because we neutralized him.
But this time, President Obrador stood by his decision.
The Mexican president has defended the military operation that captured a drug cartel leader, Ovidio Guzman, the son of jailed drug trafficker El Chapo. Violence erupted in Culiacan, a stronghold of the cartel. At least 19 members of the Sinaloa cartel and 10 members of the military were killed.
De vidas We regret the loss of lives of those who died while carrying out their jobs. We also regret other losses.
Minnie Lick was behind both operations, providing the DEA with key info about Los Chapitos while they figured out the best ways to proceed. You see, Minnie Lick only served 5 years. Considering his long list of heinous crimes, he could have easily been in a US prison for the rest of his life. This just goes to show how valuable he was to the DEA, and it turns out it was his own father who advised him to turn himself in. Once Nunez was arrested, he knew his son wouldn't be safe from Los Chapitos. Back in 2016, they'd orchestrated the kidnapping of Ivan and some of his friends at his birthday party. At the time, El Chapo was still in a Mexico prison awaiting extradition. He negotiated his son's release and suggested the Sinaloa cartel be split into a faction ruled by Los Chapitos and another faction led by Minnie Lick and Nunez. But Minnie Lick knew that as soon as it was possible, Los Chapitos would exercise the worst kind of revenge on the two of them. And even after his prison release, Minnie Lick would have to stay far away from Mexico and pretty much any area the Sinaloa had infiltrated with their soldiers. Minnie Lick has made it his life goal to leave the life of crime behind. Whether for his own safety or from a desire to make up for all the bad he's done, it's unclear. Nevertheless, today, Serrano Jr. is working as a security analyst. He is also under witness protection and is a target of constant threats from Los Chapitos. In late 2023, he gave an exclusive interview to Anabel Hernandez, one of the most prominent journalists in Mexico, bravely fighting against cartels and corruption for many years.
Nuestra colega Anabel Hernández, periodista de investigación, tuvo la oportunidad, consiguió una exclusiva con el Minnie Lick. Anabel Hernández, buenas noches. Qué gusto, querida Anabel.
¿Qué tal, Elisa? Querida Elisa, buenas noches y buenas noches al auditorio.
Anabel said that Minnie Lick confirmed the well-known facts about corruption in Mexico. If it wasn't for corruption, none of these cartels would thrive. Los Chapitos still have people on their payroll everywhere, in law enforcement, the government, and every courthouse in Mexico. That way, their crimes are protected, and their men are never arrested for long. Minnie Lick also revealed that Los Chapitos are just as bad as El Chapo, if not worse. This went hand in hand with the horrific witness testimonies told during Ovidio's trial last year. According to his former guards and sicarios, Ovidio and his brothers took pleasure in personally inflicting unimaginable pain to their enemies. Once information was obtained by these captives, typically through torture, these individuals were killed, either by or at the direction of the Chapitos themselves, and the bodies disposed of throughout the area. While many of these victims were shot, others were fed dead or alive to tigers. Indeed, Ivan and Alfredo own tigers, and it's safe to say they're not kept in ideal conditions either. As to the rivals they snatch, well, they meet fates worse than death. Death comes as mercy to these poor people. In 2017, two of El Chapo's sons kidnapped and unalived 2 Mexican federal police officers. The testimony was truly shocking. For approximately 2 hours, members of the Ninis tortured victim 5 by inserting a corkscrew into victim 5's muscles, ripping it out of his muscles, and placing hot chilies in his open wounds and nose, before being shot dead by Ivan Archibaldo Guzman Salazar. The victim and his fellow slain officer were then dumped near a motel off of a highway near the ranch. Apparently, Los Chapitos' favorite torture methods include electrocution and waterboarding, and they do this to anyone: rival sicarios, police officers, and people who fail to pay debts. And to make matters worse, sometimes Los Chapitos test out the potency of their fentanyl on their prisoners. DEA Chief Ann Milgram said, "Death and destruction are central to their whole operation. The Sinaloa cartel is a network that fuels violence and death on both sides of the border." The thing is, Los Chapitos don't seem discouraged by Ovidio's arrest or Minnie Lick's interviews. In 2024, they released one of their worst videos yet. The video begins with 3 men smiling and waving at the camera. They seem to be having fun and recording for social media. They also sing along to a song called "I'll Loosen." It's got one of those hip-hop style lyrics where a man is bragging about his wealth and claims he can have any woman he likes as a result of this, as if women are men's property. But this video doesn't end with the 3 sicarios on top. In fact, Los Chapitos used this part of the video to mock the men. It was a sort of before and after formula. First, here's the men having fun. Then, look at them now. The video shows the word después, or after, then skips to a short clip worthy of the worst horror movies. One of the three sicarios is in a forest at night, in a deep hole. He's been buried and partially covered with branches and debris. There is also a tire around his head. He can't move at all. He can only stare in terror as his rival sicarios are getting ready to take his life. And he knows it's not going to go fast. One sicario pours liquid all over his face and in the hole he's buried in. His last look at the camera is gut-wrenching. You can almost feel his fear. Then, a sicario drops a lit match in the hole and retreats to his group, casually chatting with his fellow sicarios as if they'd done nothing wrong. First, a crackling noise is heard. Then, a piercing scream through the night, covering the sicario's chatter. The screams get worse and worse until they get quieter. Then, there is a raspy exhale. Then, there is nothing. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Many of the horrors Los Chapitos commit aren't even recorded or reported. When a cartel releases one of these horrific videos, it's to send a message to other cartels. Don't mess with us. This is what happens if you do. Of course, the message is also to anyone thinking of crossing them, people like Mini Lick included. It's a way of showing they are in control. Even if El Chapo was arrested, and even if Ovidio was arrested, they are still Mexico's most powerful cartel, and they will stop at nothing to maintain their reign of terror. Many people thought of El Chapo as the Sinaloa cartel mastermind. Remove him, and the whole cartel crumbles, they argued. But they couldn't be more wrong. Since their father's arrest, Los Chapitos have grown the Sinaloa to new peaks. For starters, Los Chapitos started a profitable collaboration with the Chinese triads and delved deeper into the fentanyl trade, which is ravaging the US. Through the triads, the Sinaloa cartel ensures a steady supply of chemicals needed to produce fentanyl and methamphetamine.
We're going undercover. We've managed to infiltrate the Chinese mafia who are operating here in Mexico City. They work very, very closely with the drug cartels.
To keep a giant cartel running, you have to think of all the angles, business opportunities, and potential dangers. And Los Chapitos realized they had to make friends around the world to stay at their most powerful. Meanwhile, millions of people are losing their lives to the destructive substances they smuggle.
Fentanyl is killing everybody. You're gonna die.
O sea, hacen una vaca de los narcotraficantes aquí en Sinaloa, ofrecen un billete, juntan para tanto, ¿sabe qué? Va a llegar tanto día, tal día. Por eso es muchísimo el dinero que viene. Entonces, a lo que tengo entendido, venían 50 kilos de fentanil ahí para distribuirlo todo el estado de Sinaloa.
Business savvy as they are, Los Chapitos are molding around the market needs, so it's no longer the white powder and pot provided by their dad 3 decades ago.
It's like, okay, so what the U.S. market like? They like their avocados from Mexico and their meth from Mexico.
One of the latest demands on the market is fentanyl, and it's the most destructive narcotic yet. Around 1% of fentanyl users will die. This number is huge.
It doesn't last long, so you're sick again. Like, when you can do in the morning and you can be all good till tomorrow. Like fentanyl, you can withdraw like 3 times a day.
Fentanyl has an even faster, harsher withdrawal than other substances. And even though it can result in death with every little dose, users feel an unspeakable urge to keep using. This just goes to show the cruelty and lack of empathy Los Chapitos have. They are no wiser than El Chapo.
So we are somewhere deep in the state of Sinaloa here in Mexico, and we're just walking up to what we believe is a fentanyl lab where Sinaloa cartel members are mixing fentanyl. And the drugs that are made here are then going to go straight to the US, which is feeding the opioid crisis right now.
The DEA and the Mexican government haven't stopped fighting the cartels. The Mexican military is constantly raiding forests in hope of arresting sicarios and seizing huge labs and operations. But Los Chapitos continue to infiltrate every institution and keep high-ranking officials on their payroll. That way, they are less likely to get caught. Either the officials protect them, or they let them know when a raid is about to happen. Just like it happened when Ivan evaded arrest in October 2019. It's hard to see an end in sight, even with people like Mini Lick leaving crime behind and helping arrest Sinaloa kingpins. Los Chapitos have people everywhere, and the profits are so huge, they see no point in ever stopping.
When Mexican authorities arrested El Chapo for the 3rd time and extradited him to the US, they celebrated 1 minute too early. They thought the days of the notorious Sinaloa cartel and its unspeakable violence were finally over. But El Chapo has a big family, and his sons are more than prepared to take over the business. This became all too clear in 2019. El Chapo's sons will do anything to escape prison. And when Ovidio Guzman was arrested, all hell broke loose. Sinaloa became a war zone. Brutal violence is far from over in Mexico. Over the last few years, the death rate in Mexico has been at an all-time high. The war between the Sinaloa and the Jalisco New Generation cartel is turning cities into ghost towns and terrorizing millions of people. How big a role do El Chapo's sons have in it? And what made Ovidio Guzman's arrest so brutal? Well, we'll explore these questions and many more in today's video. Have you ever been denied a school trip because your parents were in prison? I know, it almost sounds made up, but this was the life of Ovidio Guzman Lopez growing up. He was born on March 29, 1990, the son of Joaquin Guzman, or El Chapo, and his second wife. El Chapo wasn't just a ruthless kingpin, he was also a family man and had at least 10 children. So Ovidio grew up with a large family filled with siblings and half-siblings, all fiercely protecting each other. But they were also exposed to their father's dirty business from a very young age. Ovidio's older brothers, Ivan and Jesus, began doing errands for the Sinaloa cartel as children. When Ovidio was 5, his parents enrolled him at Colegio CEYCA, or the Adusco Center for Education and Culture. This was a private Catholic school held by the Legionaries of Christ. But Ovidio was already tainted as far as his peers and teachers were concerned. 2 years before, in 1993, El Chapo was arrested for the first time and sentenced to 20 years in prison for drug trafficking and bribes. It would be bribes that helped him escape in a laundry cart in 2001, too. Everyone at Ovidio's school knew his dad was in prison, and everyone had heard of El Chapo. He was a ruthless criminal who used violence as a means to an end with ease. His teacher and classmates' parents were afraid of the Guzman family. The kids were warned to stay away from him. Who knows what would happen if a child would annoy El Chapo's child? So Ovidio was excluded from all social events, like kids' birthday parties or school trips. Once the school organized a trip to Disney World. This was a big thing, and the kids were very excited about it. Ovidio was too, but he was never invited. He found out from his schoolmates who were talking about the trip all the time. When Ovidio's mother found out, she offered the school to pay for everyone's room in exchange for Ovidio's invitation, but the school declined. Imagine the leverage the Sinaloa cartel would have over the head teacher if they accepted. So after Ovidio finished 6th grade and got a school picture taken, he dropped out of school for good. The only option for him was a life of crime. Like the rest of El Chapo's sons, Ovidio became engulfed in his father's work from a young age. By the time he was 18, he had an important role in both the production and trafficking of narcotics. In 2012, Ovidio and his older brother, Ivan, were put on a do not deal list by the United States Treasury Department. Their American assets were frozen, and the brothers were forbidden from making deals with the American citizens. And 2 years later, El Chapo was finally arrested in Mexico. He'd been on the run for 13 years. Perhaps he didn't believe it at the time. This was the beginning of the end for El Chapo. In 2015, he organized his second prison escape by digging a tunnel under his prison cell shower, the only place without security cameras. But less than a year later, he was arrested and extradited to the US. No amount of money, top lawyers, or intimidation would get him out of the ADX Florence federal prison. It's the highest security prison in the US, and the worst of the worst are held there in solitary confinement 23 hours a day. Perhaps the terrified look on El Chapo's face was warranted. In July 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison. He will also have to pay over $12 billion in forfeits. The DEA and the Mexican authorities were very happy. They'd been hunting El Chapo for years, and usually, when you take out a kingpin, it's easier to reduce their cartel to ashes. But by 2016, El Chapo had taught his sons to be ruthless, cunning, and brutal. They were ready to take over his father's business.
Judy, they are known as Los Chapitos, the four most trusted sons of the world's most notorious drug kingpin. As the I-Team has reported for several years, federal drug investigators here in Chicago consider El Chapo's sons in charge of the Sinaloa cartel that remains this area's largest trafficker of heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamines.
Even though Ovidio, aka El Ratan, is one of the younger Chapitos, he never had a problem with senseless violence.
They now say this drug lord, nicknamed the Mouse, has ordered the murders of informants, a rival drug trafficker, and a popular Mexican singer who refused to perform at his wedding.
Maybe he's taken rejection extra hard after his experience at school, but murder is hardly a solution. Ovidio, Ivan, and Jesus expanded El Chapo's business by building new, more efficient labs and extending the trafficking routes to the whole world. They also bought huge quantities of ephedrine from Argentina. This is the ingredient used in making meth. Of course, the DEA wasn't going to let this slide. They charged Ovidio with conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine, white powder, and weed to the United States. Ovidio and Ivan were just preparing for a massive shipment, 5 kilograms of coke, a ton of cannabis, and 500 grams of meth. In October 2019, 3 months after El Chapo received his life sentence, the DEA led a huge movement against Ovidio Guzman in collaboration with the Mexican military. The plan was simple: find Ovidio, arrest him, and extradite him to the US. He was to face the same fate as his father, but it wasn't that simple, not by a long shot. Ovidio and Ivan would turn Sinaloa into a bloody war zone. On October 17th, the Mexican authorities localized both brothers. First, they went after Ivan, but he was 1 minute quicker than the military. He escaped and rallied up to his army, hundreds of sicarios armed to their teeth. In the early hours of the morning, the military surrounded Ovidio's house. Ovidio initially started shooting at the officers. Of course, the officers fired back, and Ovidio soon realized he was heavily outnumbered, so he came out with his hands up. But news of his arrest traveled fast. Within moments, Ivan's giant Sicario army and other thousands of Sinaloa soldiers descended upon the Mexican military. Shockingly, it was Ovidio who seemed to try to stop it, but his efforts were too late. It was complete bloodshed. The Sicarios released cartel prisoners, set fire to cars to block important roads, and invaded the local airport. Trade and travel were completely stopped in the Sinaloa region for hours. 7 officers and 1 civilian were killed, and the civilians that survived were instructed to hide in their homes. The cartels were imposing a curfew on the town until Ovidio would be released. Sadly, it worked. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador ordered Ovidio's immediate release to prevent further loss of life. This sends the wrong message, that the authorities are easily intimidated and the cartel is in control.
According to Falco Ernst, a senior analyst for the International Crisis Group in Mexico, who explained that Ovidio López Guzman's release set a terrible precedent and communicated a message that the state, including the army, could be blackmailed and was not in control.
President Obrador explained his decision, but the cartel had already declared war. It sounds a lot like Pablo Escobar's old saying, plata o plomo, accept a bribe or a bullet. Either way, the cartel gets its way, but it shouldn't be like that in this century. By 2022, there was a $5 million reward for the captures of Ovidio and Ivan, and a $15 million reward for the arrest of El Mayo, the other leader of the Sinaloa cartel. However, this didn't mean much to Los Chapitos. They continued to run production and oversee trafficking, and they even increased El Chapo's cartel. All the while, the DEA was tracking their every movement and planning a much more complex and better organized raid. In early January 2023, 200 special forces conducted a joint operation and arrested Ovidio Guzman for a second time.
The Mexican president has defended the military operation that captured a drug cartel leader, Ovidio Guzman, son of jailed drug trafficker El Chapo. Violence erupted in Culiacan, a stronghold of the cartel. At least 19 members of the Sinaloa cartel and 10 members of the military were killed.
That's right, 29 people died in just a few minutes. The Sinaloa cartel reacted with even more brutality than in 2019. They even went into the Culiacan airport and shot at civilian planes.
These criminal organizations shot with weapons at aircraft from the Mexican Air Force and from commercial airlines, and at the international Culiacan airport facilities. Nevertheless, they did not achieve their goal of rescuing the alleged offender because we neutralized him.
In the eyes of the cartel, this was a simple tit-for-tat, but Ovidio was arrested anyway, and dozens of people died in a disproportionate act of revenge. Mexico is a constant war zone thanks to the war on drugs and a vicious Guzman family. Ovidio was taken to the military helicopter and transported to the Altiplano prison, the same high-security prison in Mexico that his father had once escaped from. But now, the Altiplano prison has a much stronger security. It's highly unlikely Ovidio will ever get out. President Obrador has once again defended the operation. This time, it seemed like he changed his mind. It was worth a few casualties to close an entire chunk of the Sinaloa cartel.
We regret the loss of lives of those who died while carrying out their jobs. We also regret other losses.
But even with Ovidio behind bars, the war is far from over. His arrest was an incentive for the Sinaloa cartel to bring even more chaos and destruction on the Sinaloa region.
Violence broke out across the state following the arrest of one of the leaders of an infamous criminal gang. Ovidio Guzman Lopez is the son of the notorious drug lord dubbed El Chapo. The arrest comes just days before US President Joe Biden is due to visit Mexico for a summit next week.
That's right, and this is not a coincidence. According to CNN, Ovidio's arrest was also a way for the Mexican government to show the US that they are now in control. They will not be bribed or intimidated by the cartels anymore. As of January 2023, Mexican authorities plan to extradite Ovidio Guzman to the US. It's likely that he will face a similar fate as El Chapo. But if he's thrown inside the Florence Supermax prison, it won't be a happy family reunion. Florence inmates spend 23 hours in solitary confinement, and their free hour is also spent alone in the presence of correctional officers. Prisoners even eat alone, except for the last 3 years of their sentence. El Chapo will never get this privilege, as he's serving a life sentence. The question is, will his son?
A visit to Mexico is a popular choice for many reasons. It is a country of great ruins, culture, food, and especially beaches.
In the United States, so many people talk about Mexico as the perfect holiday haven, filled with palm trees, golden beaches, and delicious restaurants. But other people are too afraid to cross the border. Some parts of Mexico are a constant war zone, and it's all because the never-ending war on drugs. The Mexican government is trying to contain cartels, and cartels are fighting one another, hoping to come out on top. But this means the violence never stops. In fact, as of 2023, it only seems to rise. So what are Mexico's deadliest cartel regions, and just how deadly are we talking? Let's dive in. Number 7. Tepic, Nayarit. Tepic is not Mexico's most dangerous town, but it's definitely not a tourist town. I mean, sure, you can find people juggling machetes for entertainment, but that's about as cool as it gets. Tepic is a very old town. It was founded in 1531, and for many centuries, it thrived due to its sugarcane, tobacco, and citrus fruit trades.
This city was founded as something called the Holy Spirit of Greater Spain or something, and it was the first capital of the so-called Kingdom of New Galicia, because it was founded by a different colonizer.
However, Tepic has become just as famous for its violent crime rates. In 2018, there were about 230 homicides in Tepic. That's 45 for every 100,000 people. Needless to say, that's a lot. To put things in perspective, it's more than twice Chicago's homicide rate, and that's one of the highest in the States. Tepic has an overall crime rate of 66, with particularly worrying numbers for drug dealing, armed robbery, and something no local wants to hear: an increase in crime during the last 5 years. Why is this happening, you ask? One word: cartels. The more dangerous a region or town in Mexico is, the more cartels are involved. And it gets especially worse when 2 or more cartels are fighting over that territory, as you're about to see. Number 6. Guadalajara, Jalisco. I'm sure you've heard of Guadalajara and Jalisco before. Indeed, 2 of the most notorious Mexican cartels bear these names. Guadalajara is the birthplace of the first modern-day cartel in Mexico.
Really, when the Guadalajara cartel came together, it was a group of Mexican drug traffickers saying, okay, let's share our resources.
Rafael Carro Quintero, known as the Weed King, was among the first traffickers to establish smuggling routes across the border into the United States in the 1970s.
He came from a small village in Sinaloa. Street thug, moved up pretty quickly. Smart though, for somebody with a very limited education, he saw an opportunity.
Just like Pablo Escobar in Colombia, Rafael came from a really poor family, and the promise of quick cash and fast cars appealed to him. Soon enough, Rafael met Don Nero and Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, aka El Padrino, or El Jefe. El Padrino means the Godfather, and El Jefe means the boss. These are cool names he made for himself as he established the first ever Mexican cartel, monopolizing the modern drug trade and establishing production and smuggling routes across Mexico and into the US. With the same business savvy and sheer brutality that Escobar showed around the same time, El Padrino became the ultimate kingpin. destroying anyone who laid claim to trafficking routes in the region. The Guadalajara cartel remains one of the most powerful Mexican cartels in history.
They ruled by brutality, by killing people who disagreed.
And if these names are still unfamiliar to you, El Chapo and El Mayo started their careers in the Guadalajara cartel. Yep. If it weren't for El Padrino, the future Sinaloa cartel kingpins might never have met each other. However, it was because of El Chapo and a few others that the Guadalajara cartel doesn't exist anymore. In 1984, DEA agent Kiki Camarena led a huge mission costing the Guadalajara billions of dollars and threatening to expose their entire operation. A month later, he was kidnapped, tortured, and killed at Rafael Quintero's mansion. The DEA then led their largest operation at the time, Operation Legend. Within 5 years, all Guadalajara bosses were arrested or killed. In 1989, the cartel split into tinier factions, Juarez, Tijuana, and Sinaloa. But as you can imagine, the newer cartels didn't happily share the land equally divided between them. So ever since 1989, there had been constant conflicts in Guadalajara and its surrounding region, Jalisco. Today, Jalisco is home to the horrific conflict between El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel and El Mencho's Jalisco New Generation cartel. Indeed, the CJ&G is based in Jalisco, and this only amplifies the conflict with the Sinaloa cartel. As with Tepic, the level of violent crime in Guadalajara has been on the rise over the last few years, and the rates are high for violent crimes, murder, and police corruption. In fact, the rate for the latter is 85, among the highest in the world. This means, sadly, a lot of officers are in the cartels' pockets, protecting them instead of the civilians. This only increases the danger of being in that region.
Last year, 301 bodies were discovered in the state in 41 clandestine graves, and 544 bodies were found in 2020, the highest number to date.
The numbers are bleak. Mexico's murder rate has tripled since 2006, from 9.6 to 28 homicides per 100,000 people, and Jalisco is right there in the middle of it all. Number 5. Uruapan, Michoacan. The disturbing facts and numbers of the war between the CJ&G and the Sinaloa cartel continue in the state of Michoacan. The CJ&G kingpin, Namacio Asegura Carvantes, aka El Mencho, was born in Aguililla, a small town in Michoacan. This makes him even more obsessed with controlling this region and destroying the claim of any rival cartels. To say the CJ&G is violent would be a grave understatement. They began as Los Mata Zetas, or the Zeta Killers, with the goal of destroying the Los Zetas cartel. But Los Zetas was already known as Mexico's most brutal cartel.
Here's a very small sample. Most of it is simply too grisly to show. There was the summary beheading of 200 migrants, the casino fire which killed at least 50. The preferred method of killing involves beheading with chainsaws.
They also prepare guisos. These are stews where you take a member of the family and you put them in a pig boiler and you pour gasoline on them and then you set a match to them.
So El Mencho had to top that. Shockingly, he did. Uruapan and its surrounding region, Michoacan, was the topic of turf disputes between Los Zetas, the Knights Templar, La Familia Michoacana, Los Viagras, and the CJ&G. But during the 2020s, it became clear the CJ&G was the top dog. The problem is that didn't stop the violence. Michoacan is the world's avocado capital. Avocado consumption in the United States tripled between 2001 and 2023. Canada imports 100,000 tons of avocados each year. Initially, this was great news for the Michoacan locals. People had jobs and the economy was on the rise.
El Oro Verde, esta era una región demasiado pobre, demasiado jodida, se puede decir, ¿verdad? Pues las personas han estado ya mejor económicamente hablando, ¿verdad?
But as soon as the avocado industry began rising exponentially, cartels like the CJ&G and Knights Templar began forcing their way in. They attacked farmers, stole their fruit, and extorted their business. Sadly, most of the victims in Michoacan are poor avocado farmers and their defenseless families.
Your orchard is sealed off, you have cameras everywhere, and you have guns. It's so hard for me to wrap my head around that the protection is all because you are growing this delicious fruit.
If you're doing well, they kill you, or disappear you, or they come and pull you and your family out of your house. and they take away your orchard and they cultivate it and take all the money.
In a tragic twist, it's our increase in avocado consumption that propels cartels to become more violent in this industry.
All this crime is a consequence of the increase of price of avocado. Now all of this has exploded. The extortion, kidnappings, you have to pay for protection. I'm afraid of losing my family or having them lose me.
In 2019, the CJNG invaded Uruapan to take control of its booming avocado industry. Within a few days, they left 19 dismembered bodies all across town. 6 of them were left hanging from a bridge. Imagine how many people saw the bodies, even kids, before they were taken away. And for the CJNG, this is just a way to scare other farmers into submission.
In Michoacan, the avocado industry, first they start like taxing them with like 10% of their gains. And then they say like, why is it not easier just to take over? Give me like the property titles, or I will kidnap your daughter. I will extort you. If you don't, I'm gonna shoot you.
There are 700 daily operations in Michoacan alone, just for the protection of the avocado industry. But some of these end with murder too.
They've been dropping bombs from the drones, and we have the military right here, but it doesn't seem like they're interested in stopping the other guys from dropping all those bombs.
They're dropping drone bombs just over there?
That just happened today. They dropped like 5 bombs today.
You're kidding. Where?
Across the river.
Uruapan has a staggering murder rate of 78. And over the last 5 years, the state of Michoacan recorded over 10,000 murders. On March 10, 2023, CJNG Sicario staged a series of attacks in different towns in Michoacan and used drones to launch bomb attacks against residents in the state. In 2022, one incident made headlines throughout Mexico. The CJNG ambushed a funeral in the town of Michoacan, killing up to 17 people. Then they loaded the bodies into their trucks and drove away. Their motivation is unclear, but that's the problem with cartel violence. People live in constant fear, panic, and confusion. You never know when your life can end in the most brutal way, and your family might not ever understand why. Another bleak fact is that these are murder numbers. Every year, there are hundreds or thousands more who disappear and are never found. Number 4. Culyoacan, Sinaloa. Culyoacan is a million-people metropolitan city and the capital of the infamous Sinaloa region. You guessed, Culyoacan was the birthplace of the notorious Sinaloa cartel, formerly led by El Chapo. He and his partner El Mayo laid the grounds of the cartel in the late 1980s as the Guadalajara cartel was coming to an end. At the time, their biggest disputes were with the Juarez and Tijuana cartels, fellow Guadalajara factions. But the violence between the 3 of them was nothing compared to what is happening today in Sinaloa, thanks to El Chapo's cartel, the CJNG, and the government's relentless war on drugs. In 2019 and 2023, Culyoacan was home to some of the bloodiest cartel attacks in Mexican history, and in the center of both stories was El Chapo's son, Ovidio Guzman. In 2019, El Chapo was sentenced to life in prison at the ADX Florence, US's highest security federal prison. For the Mexican government, this was a reason to celebrate. Perhaps the Sinaloa cartel would crumble under his demise just like the Guadalajara had crumbled after El Petrino's arrest. Sadly, they were wrong. The government knew the Sinaloa cartel was being led by El Chapo's 4 eldest sons.
Judy, they are known as Los Chapitos, the 4 most trusted sons of the world's most notorious drug kingpin. As the I-Team has reported for several years, federal drug investigators here in Chicago consider El Chapo's sons in charge of the Sinaloa cartel that remains this area's largest trafficker of heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamines.
So they had to go after each of Los Chapitos to arrest them and extradite them to the U.S. Of the 4, Ovidio was the youngest, but he already had a taste for blood as horrible as his dad's.
They now say this drug lord, nicknamed the Mouse, has ordered the murders of informants, a rival drug trafficker, and a popular Mexican singer who refused to perform at his wedding.
Imagine fearing for your life if you sang at his wedding, and fearing for your life if you refused. Ovidio was charged with conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine, white powder, and weed into the U.S. And in 2019, he and his older brother Ivan were just preparing for a massive shipment, 5 kilograms of coke, a ton of cannabis, and 500 grams of meth. So the Mexican government and the DEA decided to lead a ruthless mission and arrest the 2 brothers on October 17th. But the results were so messy that day is now known as Black Thursday. In the early hours of the morning, the military went after Ivan, but he was 1 minute quicker. He escaped and rallied up his army, hundreds of sicarios armed to their teeth. An hour or two later, the military surrounded Ovidio's house.
When Mexican forces approached Lopez's home, Cartel Guzman opened fire from within. However, after an intensive shootout, they were able to gain entry to the house and apprehend Lopez, who surrendered unarmed.
Ovidio initially started shooting at the officers. Of course, the officers fired back, and Ovidio soon realized he was heavily outnumbered. So he came out with his hands up.
After an intensive shootout, they were able to gain entry to the house and apprehend Lopez, who surrendered unarmed.
Pase, por favor, pase, por favor. Salgan los tres. Tranquilo. Aquí, señor. Tranquilo. Listo. Anda aquí, ¿traes armas?
The problem was, by now, Ivan knew what was happening, so he sicked his army on the authorities. Surprisingly enough, it was Ovidio who seemed to try to stop it.
Diles que paren todo.
Ya no quiero que haya desmadre.
Hey, Ovidio, páralo.
But his efforts were too late. It was complete bloodshed. The sicarios released cartel prisoners, set fires to cars to block important roads, and invaded the local airport. Trade and travel were completely stopped in the Sinaloa region for hours. 7 officers and 1 civilian were killed, and the surviving civilians were instructed to hide in their homes. The cartel imposed a curfew on the town until Ovidio would be released. Sadly, it worked. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador ordered Ovidio's immediate release to prevent further loss of life. This sends the wrong message, that the authorities are easily intimidated and the cartel is in control. The president said people's lives are more valuable than capturing a criminal, but he'd change his opinion 4 years later when Ovidio would finally be arrested again. In early January 2023, 200 special forces conducted a joint operation and arrested Ovidio Guzman for a second and hopefully final time.
The Mexican president has defended the military operation that captured a drug cartel leader, Ovidio Guzman, the son of jailed drug trafficker El Chapo. Violence erupted in Culiacan, a stronghold of the cartel. At least 19 members of the Sinaloa cartel and 10 members of the military were killed.
That's right, 29 people died in just a few minutes.
There was panic. People ditched their bags and their phones. They ditched everything in order to take shelter.
Again, newspapers reported 24 hours of continuous terror in Culiacan. That's what we need to remember. It's not just the murder rates. It's the constant fear people live in, the chaos, panic, and awareness that you could die in the blink of an eye, collateral damage to the cartel's bloody war. Ovidio Guzman was taken to a military helicopter and transported to Altiplano prison, the same high-security prison in Mexico that his father had once escaped from. But now the Altiplano prison has much stronger security. It's highly unlikely Ovidio will ever get out. But his brothers are still leading the Sinaloa cartel, and they've made it very clear they don't care about human life. They're willing to cause as much damage as they need to keep their cartel as Mexico's most powerful criminal organization. Number 3, Juarez, Chihuahua, and the Texas border.
Here at Hospital 6, there's an execution here at the corner. There's a little girl. I don't know if that's her uncle or father. It's terribly sad that this is happening in Juarez.
This is the horrific reality of Juarez.
More often, it's how you tell the story. Augustine's boss at Channel 44 is news director Edgar Roman.
Journalists in Juarez stay alive because of what they don't say. There is no government authority that will keep you safe in this city. In Mexico, when a journalist gets killed, it will never be solved.
Juarez sits on the border between Mexico and Texas, and is the most populous city of the Chihuahua state. As it turns out, all towns on the Texas border are dangerous, precisely because they're crucial smuggling points, and cartels fight for their control. On the other side of the border lies El Paso, the Texas town which is also known for its drug-related violence. In November 2022, El Paso reached an all-time murder high, with 63 homicides. Mexican cartels and turf fights are also at the center of these murders. But El Paso is nothing compared to the Juarez rates. In 2022, there were 1,034 murders in Juarez, with a population of 1.5 million. That's a murder rate of 68.
This is the most dangerous event I've ever had to cover. That's the grenade explosion. On any given day, we don't know if we will be somewhere and lose our life that day.
Yeah, as the cartels get their hands on better technology and more expensive military apparel, the violence only increases.
Go, go, go. It happened at approximately 9 in the morning. They reported at least 6 shots at the location.
In Juarez, anyone can be executed. Rival cartel sicarios, police officers, government officials, and even reporters snooping around. The moment the cartels feel threatened about being exposed, they kill whoever they believe is most dangerous. Once, they shot and killed a news reporter in front of his 8-year-old daughter.
He went to take his daughter to school. When they killed him, she saw everything. She was 8 years old when that happened.
The dark truth is, most bodies that turn up on the streets of Juarez are not sicarios, but civilians and officers struggling to end the violence.
Ciudad Juarez lies on the front line of Mexico's war on drugs, and its people have paid the price. This cemetery has doubled in size in the last decade to accommodate some of the thousands killed in this city alone.
And there are thousands more whose bodies were never found. Day and night, there are people searching for their loved ones, and forensic teams hoping to find any remains to bring closure to grieving families.
Estos son pozos de sondeo los que estamos realizando, aproximadamente de 60-80 centímetros para poder meter el canino, el K9, y que haga la búsqueda.
The number of disappeared people is so big, it simply can't be estimated. It's so scary to think about the scale of the war in Juarez City. In 2021, there were 1,412 homicides in Juarez. However, Amnesty International estimates that as many as 95% of violent crimes go unreported. Many areas of Juarez have simply been abandoned as its people are too scared to live here anymore. It's beginning to look like a ghost town.
Tenemos por lo menos 2, 3 por semana en esa zona.
At the moment, Juarez and the Chihuahua region are home to the turf wars between the Sinaloa cartel and the Juarez cartel. Sometimes, smaller cartels and the CJ&G lead attacks in the area too. But the cause of these deaths is not so much the war between cartels, as the war on drugs between cartels and the government.
Since the Mexican government declared war on the drug cartels in 2006, over 200,000 people have been killed. 30,000 more are still missing.
Yep, this is the brutal reality of the war on drugs. There just doesn't seem to be a solution to this huge problem. An even more horrible side of the story? Violent cartel crimes lead to other violent crimes being normalized. In Juarez, hundreds of girls are disappearing every year.
Esto se está repitiendo, de nuevo se están perdiendo las niñas.
No se está repitiendo. Nunca ha dejado de pasar. Nunca ha dejado de pasar. Como a 19 del mes de enero. Y van 19 jóvenes desaparecidas. Más sin embargo, la fiscalía dice que apenas van 3.
Corruption goes hand in hand with violence, and the government tries to cover up the gravity of the situation, and corrupt officers protect criminals instead of civilians. Apparently, many of the poor girls that disappear fall victim to human trafficking, which is another profitable business for the cartels.
Las llevan a una casa de seguridad y las dejan ahí, ya uno no puede hacer preguntas ni solo hace su trabajo.
¿Y el negocio de la trata de blancas es algo importante para la organización?
Pues en sí algo importante, pero es parte de, es donde agarran también dinero.
Sheesh. Number 2, Acapulco, Guerrero. Almost topping our deadly list is Acapulco, a beach resort town on Mexico's Pacific coast in the Guerrero region. Acapulco is a town of contrasts. On the one hand, you have the perfect sand, hotels, and beach bars that attract tourists year-round. In the 20th century, it was Hollywood's most popular Mexican playground. Frank Sinatra even wrote a song about it. On the other hand, though, you have news reports classifying it as Mexico's most dangerous city.
Now it is one of the most violent cities in all of Mexico. I've covered wars all over the planet, and this kind of savagery right out in the open is, even to me, shocking.
The problem is, the tourist part of the city is not separated from the violent areas, despite what the officials say.
The violence in Acapulco is not on the touristic city.
So just a few hours after the Vice Attorney General told us there's very little crime in the tourist areas, there's been a murder here on one of the main avenues in the city, which is not far from the beach.
The victim, a 54-year-old family man who owned a small food stand in this mall.
For a long time, the Beltran-Leyva cartel had complete control of Acapulco, but by 2010, the cartel kingpins were arrested or dead. As per usual, the cartel broke into smaller, warring factions. The independent cartel of Guerrero and La Veradora were among the cartels fighting for this territory, but during the 2020s, the Sinaloa cartel emerged victorious after backing La Veradora to destroy the independent cartel. You might think, okay, if the Sinaloa has monopolized the region, then the violence can stop, right? Well, no. There will always be other cartels wanting a piece of the pie, and the Sinaloa cartel is determined to keep authorities at bay. This means there are constant shootouts with the police, and sometimes they result in collateral damage. In April 2023, 2 tourists were killed in a shootout in Acapulco Center. The third person in the group was also shot, but survived.
A witness said the victims had arrived in Acapulco the day before for the Easter week vacation. She said the victims were on 2 all-terrain vehicles when assailants rode up on a motorcycle and opened fire on them. The victims' bodies were found still aboard the ATVs.
In a tragic twist, the violence has only increased in 2023. There were murders happening almost every single day, and reporters aren't even allowed to film or document all of them.
In the end, we witnessed 6 homicide scenes in 4 days, and that doesn't even include the ones we were told were too dangerous to film.
Acapulco is now known as one of the most dangerous places in the whole world. In 2020, it was classified as the world's 3rd deadliest and most dangerous city. The murder rate stands at 105. Needless to say, this is destroying the tourism business, and lots of people are deserting their hometown in hopes of a safer life. Just like Juarez, Acapulco is slowly becoming a ghost town and graveyard of thousands of unidentified victims.
Y son las 3 de la tarde o 2 de la tarde y donde vivas se escuchan balazos. Donde estés y sabes que murió alguien. Y si sabes que murió alguien, ni siquiera te acercas, además corres, porque no vas a brindar auxilio.
Anna's best friend was shot and killed trying to help a victim.
Yo creo que entre la balacera, quien la vio, probablemente dijo, es que ella ya me vio, la voy a matar.
It's heartbreaking to think the brutality really has no limit in places like this. Cartel assassins don't have a moral code, and they don't care how many people they kill. After a certain kill count, taking lives might even become pleasurable for them. And number 1, Tijuana, Baja California. Topping the list is not Mexico's, but the world's deadliest region, Tijuana. Tijuana borders San Diego, California, and is part of the beautiful Baja California region in Mexico. But it's also a hub of cartel activity, wars, and constant violent crimes. Tijuana is considered the most dangerous place in the entire world, and its murder rate is somewhere between 105 to 138, according to various records. In Tijuana, police officers die just because they're police officers.
27-year-old police officer was shot outside his house while leaving for his job. 2 suspects have been arrested, but the investigation continues.
Tijuana is the hometown of the notorious Tijuana cartel. It was one of the 3 factions split from the Guadalajara cartel in the late 1980s. From its beginning, the Tijuana cartel was led by the Arellano Felix family, which is El Padrino's family. His 2 nephews, Ramon and Benjamin Arellano Felix, took over the cartel in 1987. Today, Benjamin is in prison with a life sentence, and his little brother was killed by a police officer on El Chapo's payroll. The Arellano Felix family is a large one, and it seems like Anadina, aka La Efe, or the boss, has been in charge of the Tijuana cartel for a while. However, Anadina is a quiet figure who resorts to violence only as a last resort, so it's not her cartel that's causing the most ruckus. Nope, it's once again the Sinaloa cartel. The Sinaloa and Tijuana cartels have been enemies since the very beginnings in 1987, but today it seems like Tijuana is small potatoes compared to Los Chapitos organization. Tijuana is a constant war zone, its streets more ravaged than many cities that are actually at war. That's because cartel sicarios have no problem with killing people in broad daylight. Sometimes they proudly display mutilated bodies to instill fear in people and intimidate rival cartels into submission.
Jorge Luis Gonzalez is dead, shot in the head. His sister is disconsolate.
Some people can't even afford to bury their loved ones properly, so they just end up in a public cemetery, piled up on top of each other. Many others are never identified, so they're just dumped on the same grounds with a simple cross next to them.
Some of the city's poorest residents are buried in this public cemetery in eastern Tijuana. Those homicide victims whose bodies are not claimed or cannot be identified are sent to the common grave, buried in wood coffins stacked a half dozen deep.
This is the reality for so many people in Tijuana and Mexico. They live in constant fear for their and their loved ones' lives. Then, when they die, they're quickly forgotten and thousands of others make the headlines every single year. Cartels are a disease that is ravaging entire regions of Mexico and turning once luxurious cities into ghost towns. And the government's war on drugs seems to make it all worse. So is there any end to the violence, or can these deadly regions be saved? Back when Miguel Feliz Gallardo, or El Padrino, took control of the entire Mexican business and established the notorious Guadalajara cartel, he was the first of their kind. Then came Pablo Escobar, who built the ultimate coke empire. But Escobar died 3 decades ago, and since then, many other people have tried to grow their own organized crime empires. Some of them are even scarier than Escobar and El Chapo.
Tonight, the DEA is offering $10 million for information leading to the arrest of the Mexican kingpin known as El Mencho. He's blamed for a flood of narcotics into the U.S.
The latest cartel target, Mexico's military. The Jalisco New Generation cartel took the fight to the next level, shooting down a military helicopter with a rocket-propelled grenade.
Let's explore their terrifying stories. Some of the most dangerous drug lords in business today are the ones we don't know about. Kenny Young Ang Chin is one of them. If you look up his name online, you find one picture of him and the fact that he's one of the most wanted men by the DEA. For an aspiring star, internet anonymity would be the worst nightmare. But for a brutal kingpin, it's the dream. No one knows who you are, where you are, or why you're so sought out by the authorities. Kenny Young Ang Chin is wanted by the DEA for the huge quantity of heroin he distributes in the United States. And needless to say, when you control a large narcotics business, it comes with threats, violence, and even assassinations. But there's an even darker side of Young Ang Chin's story. Sadly, he employs minors to do his dirty work. This is wrong on so many levels, but for him, it's just business. Minors, especially if they're illegal immigrants, are much easier to corrupt with small money and much more unaware of the dangers of trafficking. If they end up arrested or even dead, it's not Chin who suffers. In his mind, they're just expendable. So you can see why Chin is a wanted man, but he's so well hidden, it might be a while before the DEA finally gets their hands on him. These are Jesus and Ivan, the sons of the notorious kingpin El Chapo. Today, they're just as ruthless as their now incarcerated father. After the Guadalajara cartel was dissolved in 1989, El Chapo, or Joaquin Guzman, grew his own empire, the Sinaloa cartel. It became one of the most violent, bloodthirsty, and power-hungry cartels in the entire world. At its peak, the Sinaloa cartel controlled half of the Mexican drug trade and made $3 billion every single day. El Chapo was a ruthless kingpin, killing and maiming his way to the top of the pyramid. But he was also a family man. Indeed, El Chapo had at least 10 children. Some think it's as many as 20. And much like traditional patriarchy, El Chapo made his eldest sons into his most trusted servants.
Judy, they are known as Los Chapitos, the 4 most trusted sons of the world's most notorious kingpin.
Indeed, Ivan and Jesus didn't really stand a chance at any other career. They're the sons of El Chapo and his first wife, Maria Alejandra Salazar Hernandez. Maria herself was related to Hector Luis Palma Salazar, aka El Güero. The two started dating while they were working for the Guadalajara cartel. Needless to say, this was the only model Ivan and Jesus saw growing up. By the time they were teenagers, their father had completely engulfed them in the cartel business, and because Ivan and Jesus were the eldest, their father trusted them with taking charge of trafficking. They coordinated transportation from Colombia and Ecuador to Mexico, and from Mexico to the United States. Then they oversaw the distribution of narcotics to wholesale customers in the US and collected subsequent proceeds. Had El Chapo remained free, his sons might have never made it to kingpin level. But in 2016, El Chapo was arrested for the 3rd and final time. He was extradited to the United States and sent to the Florence Supermax, the country's highest security prison. So it was time for Ivan and Jesus to step out of their father's shadow. They grew the Sinaloa cartel by building new, more sophisticated labs and expanding transportation to ships and planes. This might sound like they're just good businessmen, but the Sinaloa cartel also deals with bribing officials, killing enemies, threatening their families, and even killing authorities who stand in their way. In 2019, Ivan led an extremely bloody rescue of his half-brother Ovidio. Ovidio had been arrested by Mexican police, but Ivan couldn't handle it, so he sent a whole army of sicarios to his rescue. Officers and civilians lost their lives in the process. Jesus is no angel either. Apart from overseeing trafficking and bribing officials, he ordered assassinations and kidnappings. He's the cartel's mad dog, as well as the brains behind the labs and transportation. In 2012, the United States Department of the Treasury designated Ivan under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act, naming him a lieutenant of El Chapo Guzman in the Sinaloa cartel. Today, there are $5 million rewards on both Ivan's and Jesus' heads. They're considered to be new rulers of the Sinaloa cartel. But wait, there's someone else sharing the throne. This is Ismael Zambada Garcia, aka El Mayo. In 2016, El Chapo was arrested and extradited to the US to spend his life in prison. People were expecting a trial where El Chapo denied his crimes, but they didn't expect him to point his finger at someone else entirely. El Chapo shocked the jury when he claimed people should be looking at the real leader of the Sinaloa cartel, El Mayo. El Mayo has been around for a long time. He was friends with El Padrino and climbed the ranks of the Guadalajara cartel with El Chapo, who started as the cartel's truck driver. But El Mayo wanted to be his own boss. Even after his own family was killed by a rival cartel, he continued to climb the ranks and establish himself as Sinaloa's boss. This came in handy as El Chapo was in and out of prison. By 2000, he'd superseded El Chapo, who was in prison in Mexico and was smuggling thousands of tons of Colombian candy, dust, smack, and pot. In 2009, he was indicted for his crimes against the US. The Sinaloa cartel is a really nasty one. They even kill women and children. Sometimes the sicarios violate women and force their families to watch. It's not even about the money anymore. It's about power and unspeakable violence. And as the DEA is fighting hard to catch El Mayo, several more people fall victim to the Sinaloa cartel. Today, there's a staggering $15 million reward for any information leading to El Mayo's capture. While El Chapo's sons, Ivan and Jesus, had various run-ins with American law, El Mayo continues to evade the DEA to this day. Age 74, he is still one of the most ruthless lords out there, and he hasn't spent 1 minute inside a prison. In 2010, El Mayo broke from cover in a very strange interview with the Mexican magazine Proceso. He confessed that he would happily take his own life rather than go to prison. But when other Sinaloa sicarios are interviewed about their boss, they refuse to say his name. If El Mayo finds out someone talked about him, he will sentence him to the most brutal end he can imagine. El Mayo is just as brutal as El Chapo, if not more. There's a theory that El Mayo threw El Chapo under the bus as he encouraged his son, Vicente, to turn on El Chapo in return for his own freedom. Considering that he is still evading justice while ruling the largest Mexican cartel, El Mayo might just be the most ruthless and cunning kingpin today. This is Dario Asuga. He is known as the most dangerous trafficker in the world. He was born in September 1971 in Nicoclí, northwestern Colombia. When he was 18, he joined the Popular Liberation Army, a daredevil guerrilla group with a goal to defend poor, rural people from landowners and the government. Within 2 years, the guerrilla group had signed a peace agreement with the government, but Dario had gotten a thirst for violence. He then joined the United Self-Defenses of Colombia, a far-right paramilitary group and trafficking organization. Around this time, he became known as Otoniel. In 2005, Otoniel started working for Daniel Renton Herrera, the kingpin of the Los Carabineros cartel. This is the notorious Gulf Clan. Otoniel's bloodthirst and cunning led him to the top of the game in 2009. Even after his own brother was killed in a police raid, Otoniel didn't back down. He was only more power hungry. The Gulf Clan is extremely well organized, and his army of assassins terrorized much of northern Colombia to gain control of major smuggling routes through thick jungles north to Central America and onto the US. Imagine being responsible for raising the homicide rates in the country that's already known for a high murder rate. In 2009, Otoniel was indicted for the first time in Manhattan federal court on narcotics charges and for allegedly providing assistance to a far-right paramilitary group designated as a terrorist organization by the U.S. government. Later indictments accused him of importing into the U.S. at least 73 metric tons of white powder between 2003 and 2014 through Venezuela, Guatemala, Mexico, Panama, and Honduras. But Otoniel continued to elude the authorities for years. Meanwhile, his reign of terror was only reaching new heights. But Pablo Escobar's reign came to a brutal end, and so did Dario's. In October 2021, he was finally captured in Colombia.
Colombia said the country's most wanted drug lord will be extradited to the United States. Dario Antonio Usuga, better known as Otoniel, was seized at his hideout in an operation involving hundreds of soldiers. The U.S. had placed a $5 million bounty on his head.
Otoniel was extradited to the U.S., and it's likely he will never be free again, but his reign of terror is far from over. In May 2022, the Gulf Cartel laid siege to several communities in Colombia as a sign of protest against Otoniel's capture. The Sicarios imposed strict lockdowns, terminated local businesses, closed off roads, and threatened residents. If they left their homes, they would set their cars and homes on fire. They destroyed 118 cars anyway. Also, they killed 24 people and attempted to kill 15 more. A long list of towns also ran out of basic supplies because of the strike. So the Gulf Clan continues to rule with fear even after the demise of their leader. Or is Otoniel still ruling the cartel from prison? Let's leave Colombia and fly to Honduras, where one of the most dangerous drug lords might be hiding. This is Yulan Archaga Carias, also known as Alexander Mendoza, or Porky. He's the leader of the brutal MS-13 gang. In November 2021, Carias was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. He is wanted for racketeering, narcotics trafficking, and firearm offenses. But just like most drug lords, Carias doesn't just do illegal business. He orders hits on anyone involved in rival gangs, and might even take pleasure in doing the deed himself. In 2008, he was convicted, charged, and sent to prison in Honduras. But 2 years later, he escaped in the most violent way. An army of 20 gunmen dressed in military and police uniforms stormed the courthouse. While Carias was brought there for a hearing, they killed everyone on site and took Carias with them. To this day, he is wanted both in Honduras and the United States. It's believed he is hiding in Honduras, but truth be told, he could be hiding anywhere, all the while ordering hits and leading the MS-13 from the shadows. This is Nemesio Carvantes, aka El Mencho.
Tonight, the DEA is offering $10 million for information leading to the arrest of the Mexican drug kingpin known as El Mencho. He's blamed for a flood of narcotics into the U.S.
The Sinaloa cartel is not the only scary Mexican cartel. In fact, there's an even bloodier one today, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, or CJNG. It's a ruthless, power-hungry cartel that has made a habit out of torturing its enemies to death and putting videos of it online. CJNG is run by none other than El Mencho.
Ocho, Ocho! Una aguililla! Ocho, heridos! X13, Ocho!
This is just one moment recorded by Vice when 14 police officers were killed and many others wounded by the CJNG. Throughout the last 2 decades, CJNG are responsible for hundreds of civilian deaths and endless bloody wars with the rival cartels.
Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, CJNG, is the single criminal organization most responsible for these deaths on both sides of the border.
Kidnappings, and piles of bodies have become normalized in a huge area of Mexico ever since the CJNG was created around 2009. And a big chunk of Mexico is unsafe to live in simply because of the constant wars carried out by CJNG against rival cartels, such as United Cartels. El Aguaje was literally turned into a ghost town after one particularly bloody battle. The town was deserted because of El Mencho's ambition to control the Mexican drug trade.
El Aguaje se convirtió en un pueblo fantasma. Las casas pues ya no son las mismas, todas están balaceadas. Antes aquí es donde estaban los Jaliscos. Esto era la barricada de ellos.
El Mencho first came to the U.S. as an illegal immigrant. After he was deported, he started working for the Millennial Cartel. He slowly climbed its ranks, and when the Millennial bosses were killed or put in jail, he decided to start his own cartel, the Jalisco New Generation. CJNG quickly became one of the most brutal cartels out there. El Mencho had people infiltrate the police so that they always know when they're being threatened. When El Mencho found out the authorities were planning to arrest 2 smaller bosses, El Ere and El Apa, he ordered an operation meant to distract the military. It was a particularly bloody one.
In early August, violence exploded in western Mexico. Roads were blocked, cartel gunmen cruised the streets at will, and in the city of Guanajuato, 25 outlets of a popular convenience store were burned to the ground.
CJ&G makes a big thing out of its military equipment and heavy artillery. The CJ&G cartel was inspired by an older cartel, Los Zetas. They also use military-grade weapons and ex-soldiers to spread fear and commit more organized crimes. But the CJ&G glorifies violence to an unprecedented level. It's not even about money anymore. It's about territory and letting people know what happens if you mess with the CJ&G. It's believed that this is how El Mencho eludes the police to this day. He's not on the run. He's perfectly safe in Michoacan, where the cartel is based. And he's always surrounded by a military-trained army. Anyone who would try to arrest him would end up getting shot before you could get close to him. El Mencho doesn't believe in bribery, like the Sinaloa cartel leaders. Instead, he uses sheer force and intimidation to get what he wants. For his soldiers, this is an honorable thing. CJ&G loves El Mencho.
Yo sé quién es mi patrón, señor Don Mencho, una persona muy honorable y las personas que lo conocen saben la calidad de persona que es. Si yo no pensara de la forma que yo pienso, yo no estaría, no perteneciera o no fuera parte de este cartel.
This sounds a bit too much like a cult of personality, but sadly, this is how kingpins get to the top. They describe themselves with big words like honorable, fair, and ambitious, all the while killing, torturing, and intimidating people into submission. El Mencho rules with fear. Every CJ&G soldier sees what happens to those who disobey him. They have no choice but to respect him, whether they believe in his values or not. As of today, El Mencho is Mexico's most wanted. Why? His cartel is now targeting the Mexican military.
The latest cartel target, Mexico's military. The Jalisco New Generation cartel took the fight to the next level, shooting down a military helicopter with a rocket-propelled grenade.
The helicopter was thought to be tracking El Mencho. He couldn't have that. According to the DEA, El Mencho is even more sneaky.
And all that violence is only to have leverage in the negotiations with the government, with politicians, right? They create this chaos to go and sit with the local politicians and say like, okay, do you want more or shall we negotiate this?
It really seems like there's no end to El Mencho's lust for power. If the authorities give him what he wants, he will only militarize some more and make the CJ&G more powerful. If they decline, he will continue to kill officers and civilians until they do. Today, even the Mexican military lives in constant fear of CJ&G attacks.
¿Un dron o qué? Ese mero. ¿Dónde está el dron? Está volando derecho arriba. Hay un dron.
At the end of 2022, The Guardian reported 26,000 murders in Mexico. The last few years have been record-setting in terms of homicides. In 2021, there were 94 homicides per day. Violence is at an all-time high, and El Mencho is responsible for a huge part of it. Will El Mencho ever get caught? And will CJ&G's insatiable lust ever be put to an end? According to recent rumors, it just might. In 2020, it was reported that El Mencho suffered from kidney disease and had built his own private hospital to treat it. In February 2022, unconfirmed reports started popping up with even bigger news that El Mencho died in a hospital following a respiratory arrest. His death has never been confirmed, and cartel members give conflicting stories about it.
So with all the rumors around El Mencho being dead or very ill or out of the cartel, that started, I guess they started like around 2020 when we started reading about El Mencho being out of the Cartel Jalisco. I reached out to two middle range commanders inside the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. One of them believed that he was just literally just out of the cartel. He's well, he's alive, he's just like stepped up or stepped out of the cartel. And the other guy believes that El Mencho is actually pretty ill or might even be dead.
But if El Mencho is truly dead, it may just be the first step toward the end of cartel violence in Mexico. At the moment, the war between Sinaloa cartel and the CJ&G is the root cause of most victims in the country. But you know how sometimes when lords die, the whole cartel crumbles under him? As of 2023, it already seems like CJ&G is splitting up into smaller factions and fighting each other.
Tomito, el dron, güey. Tráeme el dron. El dron. Tráeme el dron, güey. Las pilas. Le dieron los putazos.
While El Mencho remains in the shadows, his fate unconfirmed, his brutal legacy continues. We have yet to see an end to the cartel wars, and the CJ&G is still one of Mexico's biggest threats ever. Let us fly all the way to Italy for this story. Rocco Morabito was one of Italy's most wanted men. He was known as the King of Milan and the ultimate escape artist. Rocco was born into the Calabrian town of Africo in a family already tied to the mafia. One of his relatives was mafia boss Giuseppe Morabito, and by the time he was a young man, Rocco was a key figure in the 'Ndrangheta mafia, which controls white powder trafficking in Italy and abroad. Rocco was still in his 20s when he became one of the most wanted traffickers in Italy after he established brand new coke smuggling routes from South America into Milan. He was a wanted man for 3 decades before the police managed to catch him. When he realized the police were on his tail, Rocco Morabito fled to Brazil and assumed a fake identity, Francisco Capeledo. Then he moved to Uruguay, where he lived in a lavish resort villa for 13 years. His home was filled with incredibly expensive art, but Rocco would live a modest life outside his house, so as to not attract attention. However, he couldn't help but to throw his daughter a super luxurious birthday party, and that's when people started to question his riches. Then, Rocco made another mistake. He registered his daughter at school under her real name. After this, the police put him under surveillance. In September 2017, Rocco had a fight with his wife and he moved into a hotel in Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay. That's when the police swooped in. They found a gun, 13 cell phones, and 150 passport photos of Rocco in different guises. But even this wasn't the end of Rocco's freedom. In 2019, he was in Uruguay prison awaiting extradition to Italy when he escaped through a hole in the roof. By 2020, Interpol was dead set on destroying 'Ndrangheta mafia, so they put more resources than ever into tracking down Rocco Morabito. In 2021, he was located and arrested in João Pessoa, Brazil. And in July 2022, he was finally sent over to Italy to be tried for his crimes. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison at the age of 55. This means that he will be released at 85 or die in prison. With such strong ties to the notorious 'Ndrangheta mafia, it's likely Rocco will still conduct business from inside his prison. This is Ramo Cipriano. He may not be the most dangerous drug lord on this list, but he is the youngest. He was born in 1997. In 2023, he'll be turning 26. And yet, he's one of the most wanted men in the United States. According to DEA, he resides in California. And this is where he conducts business on behalf of the Sinaloa cartel. Indeed, the notorious Sinaloa cartel has people everywhere, and they go to extreme lengths to ensure their ongoing growth. Cipriano is in charge of white powder distribution on the West Coast, but he is slowly climbing the ranks of the cartel, so he already has many people working for him, wreaking havoc and spreading violence to protect him and his cartel. This is the problem. When you want to climb a cartel's ranks, you need to prove that you're one of the most vicious and violent people out there. And as you get desensitized to violence, you only become worse. As Ramo is still on the run and eluding the DEA, he could still grow the Sinaloa network in the US, making them more powerful than ever. Ramo can be seen as a symbol of just how dangerous and brutal narcotics gangs are in general. The bloodlust never stops. The cartels recruit people who will do anything to have money and power, violent, vengeful people who don't care for justice and even get a kick out of inflicting pain. Ramo Cipriano was born in 1997. Chin is even recruiting minors. How many people are being recruited every single day into a life of unspeakable crime? And will it ever stop? As the young people grow up, they can become the new Escobar, El Chapo, and El Mayo. Hey, thanks for watching. What do you think about this case? Who do you think is the most dangerous drug lord today? And did we miss any? Let us know in the comment section, and before you leave, make sure you hit those like and subscribe buttons. Till next time, and stay safe.